Hey guys, imagine standing in the mist outside a newly completed Norman castle, the wind whipping through your cloak as you glimpse the banners of a foreign duke rising over an alien throne. In the next few minutes, you'll learn how a tangled web of conquest, family betrayal, and ruthless ambition forged the early foundations of what would become the English crown. Stick around. By the end of this video, you might never look at your history books the same way. William the Conqueror strode ashore in 1066, his armored silhouette cutting through the chaos of boats and oars on the grey English Channel. Claiming that Harold Godwinson had betrayed an oath, he carried a papal banner and a burning desire to seize the English throne. On October 14th at Hastings, arrow met shield, Saxon wall met Norman cavalry. With Harold fallen, William planted his standard on English soil, signaling the end of Anglo-Saxon rule and the dawn of a new era. His victory was decisive, but consolidating power would require more than battlefield glory. Within months, William began reshaping the landscape. Timber fortifications gave way to imposing stone keeps. The Tower of London rose as a stark reminder that this conqueror would brook no rebellion. Every noble Saxon earldom was redistributed to Norman loyalists, erasing an old aristocracy almost overnight. In 1086, the Domesday Book, an unprecedented survey, mapped every furlong of land, recorded every cow, and fixed taxes in ink. The crown now knew its kingdom as intimately as a parent knows their child. When William died in 1087, his sons immediately turned on one another. William II, known to history as Rufus for his ruddy complexion, inherited England. He was a tyrant cloaked in sharp wit, presiding over hunting parties by day and brutal crackdowns by night. He clashed incessantly with the church, seizing ecclesiastical lands and pocketing the revenue. Yet his rule also stabilized Norman England, quashing rebellions in Wales and Scotland. In 1100, Rufus met an unexpected end, an arrow in New Forest, and rumors swirled that his younger brother, Henry, had orchestrated the deed. Henry I ascended the throne the same day that Rufus fell, racing from Winchester to claim the crown. A ruler of surprising intellect, he codified laws, improved river traffic, and even founded the first royal treasury at Winchester. Yet his personal life veered into darkness when his only legitimate son perished in the White Ship disaster of 1120. With no male heir, Henry named his daughter Matilda as his successor, demanding the barons swear fealty to her. But on his death in 1135, most reneged. The realm plunged into the anarchy as Matilda's cousin Stephen seized the crown. Stephen of Blois was affable, even generous, but a weak steward. England fractured into rival fiefdoms, each baron guarded his castle like a dragon hoarding gold. Matilda led a daring assault on London in 1141, capturing Stephen at Winchester only to lose her own chance at kingship when she stalled at Westminster. For nearly 2 decades, murder and siege became quotidian. Only in 1153 did Stephen and Matilda's son Henry, later Henry II, reach a peace agreement. Stephen would reign until death, and then Henry would succeed. And so Plantagenet rule began in earnest when Henry II ascended in 1154. A king forged by exile and rebellion himself, he spoke French, English, and Norman with equal fluency. Ambitious, he sought to knit his sprawling dominions, Anjou, Normandy, Aquitaine, and England, into a single Angevin empire. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine brought vast lands in southern France under his banner, but magnetized dynastic discord as well. Together, they parented 4 sons with royal fever running through their veins. Henry's legal reforms left an irreversible mark on England. He established itinerant judges who carried royal writs from town to town, ensuring that common law, rather than feudal custom, prevailed. The king's courts became the ultimate authority. Any noble who defied the crown risked forfeiture of lands and status. This centralization sowed the seeds of modern statehood. Yet Henry II's reign was marred by a dark betrayal, the murder of Thomas Becket. Becket had been Henry's close friend and chancellor, a man of sharp humor and quick intellect. When the king named him Archbishop of Canterbury, he expected a pliant collaborator. But Becket abandoned secular comforts to defend church autonomy, excommunicating bishops who sided with the crown. Frustrated, Henry is said to have muttered, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 knights took the hint, perhaps deliberately misreading royal intent, and on December 29, 1170, they murdered Becket at the altar. The martyrdom sparked outrage across Christendom, forcing Henry to do public penance and bolstering the church's moral authority. By the time Henry II died in 1189, he had bequeathed a realm both more powerful and more precarious than he had found it. His eldest surviving son, the lion-hearted Richard I, inherited a kingdom whose treasury was near empty, but whose reputation is shown like burnished steel. Richard the Lionheart spent precious little time in England. Swept up by the call of the Third Crusade, he embarked on a campaign to retake Jerusalem from Saladin. He won Tiberias and Acre, but Jerusalem remained elusive. On the return journey, he was captured near Vienna and ransomed to the tune of some 150,000 marks, an astronomical sum. English taxes soared to pay the ransom, igniting resentment among barons. Richard's brief 9-year reign ended in 1199 when an arrow struck him at the siege of Châlus-Chabrol, a seemingly mundane wound that festered and felled a king. John, the youngest Plantagenet, then claimed the throne. History's verdict on John is merciless. Soft sword, they called him, Lachlan, because his elder brothers had left him little inheritance. But it was John's mismanagement and cruelty that would define his legacy. Pious nobles bristled under his heavy-handed taxation and arbitrary justice. When he quarreled with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Pope placed England under interdict. That meant sacraments halted, churches stood empty, and the king's spiritual authority lay in tatters. In 1215, a group of rebel barons marched on London and forced John to affix his seal to a document they had drafted, Magna Carta. This great charter bound the king to respect certain feudal rights, guaranteed swift justice, and barred arbitrary imprisonment. Though John quickly renounced it and war resumed, Magna Carta endured as a symbol of constraint on royal power. John died in 1216, leaving a boy king, Henry III, upon the throne. England would now be governed in the name of a child, with regents and councils wielding real power. Henry III, in time, sought to emulate his grandfather, Henry II's grandeur, but lacked his spine. He lavished funds on French-style palaces and religious relics, including the crown of thorns straining royal coffers. His favoritism toward foreign favorites inflamed baronial anger, eventually culminating in the provisions of Oxford in 1258, a precursor to constitutional government that compelled the king to rule with a council. When Henry III died in 1272, his son Edward I, dubbed Longshanks for his towering height, took the reins. Edward was a formidable organizer and a relentless soldier. He conquered Wales, pursuing the dream of a unified Britain, and, after subduing Llywelyn the Last in 1282, built a chain of mighty castles, Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, that still scar the Welsh landscape with their silhouette. Edward then turned north, clashing with Scottish nobles and calling for homage from King John Balliol. Edward I's legal reforms further strengthened the monarchy. He summoned parliament with commoners, knights, and burgesses seated alongside barons and bishops, an embryonic form of representative government. His statutes clarified land tenure, property rights, and the jurisdiction of royal courts. Though his reign was sometimes harsh, especially in punitive levies and expulsions of Jewish communities in 1290, Edward laid the administrative bedrock of the English state. As the first part of our journey ends, we've witnessed the birth of medieval England, a realm shaped by conquest, legal innovation, and the ceaseless ambitions of its kings. From William's castles to Henry's courts, from Richard's crusading valor to John's chartered rebellion, each monarch carved his mark into the nation's destiny. In the next chapter, we'll delve into the Plantagenet heirs, Edward II's tragic reign, Edward III's 100 Years' War, and the birth of the House of Lancaster and York. Trust me, you won't want to miss how family drama would ignite decades of conflict that still echo through history. The next heir to wear the Plantagenet crown was a monarch whose reign would be remembered as one of the most troubled in English history. Edward II ascended the throne in 1307, inheriting a kingdom still grappling with the aftermath of his grandfather, Edward I's relentless campaigns and administrative overhauls. But unlike the iron-willed Longshanks, Edward II lacked both his predecessor's martial vigor and political acumen. From the outset, his favoritism and personal entanglements would sow the seeds of factional strife that tore the realm apart. Edward II had been crowned at Westminster Abbey barely weeks after his father's death. His marriage to Isabella of France promised a new Franco-English alliance, yet it quickly soured under Edward's obsession with his male companions, most notoriously Piers Gaveston. Gaveston, exiled by Edward I for his undue influence over the prince, returned to England at Edward II's bidding. As royal favorite, he received lavish estates, titles, and the most coveted positions at court, provoking outrage among the baronage. By 1308, the barons, led by Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, forced Edward II to exile Gaveston under the ordinances of 1311, a series of edicts meant to curb royal prerogative. But Edward's defiance saw Gaveston restored in 1312. A coalition of disaffected nobles instead caught and executed him in a hideous ambush at Blacklow Hill. His head was sent to Queen Isabella in a bloody spectacle that marked the first sign that the Plantagenet monarchy could be undone not by foreign enemies but by its own great men. Gaveston's death, far from stabilizing the country, only deepened the fault lines. Edward II turned to a new favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. The Despensers quickly amassed lands confiscated from the Marcher lords, weaponizing royal authority to dispossess barons and build their own power network across Wales and the Welsh marches. By 1321, the barons rose in revolt once more. Edward responded with force, crushing the rebellion at the Battle of Boroughbridge in 1322. Thomas of Lancaster was captured and beheaded, his fall a grim warning that the crown would brook no challenge. Yet the Despensers' tyranny bred its own backlash. Isabella, humiliated by her husband's infidelity and marginalization, fled to France in 1325, taking her son Edward of Windsor with her. There she forged an alliance with Roger Mortimer, a Marcher lord whose estates had been stripped by the Despensers. In 1326, this unlikely duo crossed back into England with a small mercenary force, rallying weary barons and peasants alike under the banner of Despenser oppression. Edward II's support collapsed. Many of his closest allies refused to draw sword, for a king seen as a puppet of rapacious favorites. Within months, Edward II was deposed in Parliament, the first English king ever so removed, and forced to abdicate in favor of his son, now Edward III. The fallen monarch was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, where, in 1327, he met a mysterious and brutal end. Rumor says he was murdered on the orders of Mortimer, though chroniclers quibble over details. What mattered most was not how Edward died, but that his son, a mere teenager, now held the reins of power. Edward III's early reign was dominated by Mortimer and the now Queen Dowager Isabella, who ruled as regents. Their heavy taxation and mismanagement soon proved unpopular. By 1330, the young king, barely 18, had enough. In a midnight coup, he arrested Mortimer at Nottingham Castle and executed him for treason. Isabella, disgraced, spent her remaining years in honorable exile. With Mortimer's downfall, Edward reclaimed his crown. From that moment on, Edward III would define himself as a warrior king. The Plantagenets had long looked across the Channel with fondness. Now the king claimed a right to the French crown itself. In 1337, he formally asserted himself as rightful heir to France, launching what would become the 100 Years' War. His knights and men-at-arms crossed into northern France in 1337. By 1340, the English fleet had routed the French at Sluys, securing command of the Channel. But as war raged, another foe stalked his own people, the Black Death. In 1348, the plague swept across England, killing perhaps a third of the population within 2 years. Fields lay fallow, villages emptied, and laborers could demand higher wages. Edward III's attempts to freeze wages and impose new poll taxes only fueled resentment. The economic and social upheaval of the plague would culminate 2 decades later in the Peasants' Revolt, but in Edward's reign it forced the crown to adapt. The king replaced massive feudal levies with paid professional armies, securing military victories on a scale previously unimaginable. At Crécy in 1346, English archers devastated the French cavalry. A year later at Calais, Edward forced the city to surrender after a prolonged siege. Calais would remain an English foothold on the continent for over 2 centuries. Edward's martial successes earned him the title King of England and France from his proud court banners. Yet the constant campaigning drained the royal coffers. and in his later years Edward resorted to ever more inventive forms of royal debt and taxation, alienating both nobles and commons. By 1377, Edward III lay on his deathbed, an aging warrior who had redefined what it meant to be a medieval king. His grandson Richard II, a boy of 10, would inherit a realm rich in prestige yet fraught with the tensions Edward had set in motion. The regency that followed stoked rivalries between powerful barons, and the young Richard would struggle to assert his authority against a fractious nobility. Richard II's early years were marked by crisis. In 1381, the poll tax imposed to finance the 100 Years' War ignited the peasants' revolt. Led by Wat Tyler and the fiery preacher John Ball, tens of thousands of rebels marched on London. They stormed the Tower, beheaded Archbishop Sudbury, and forced concessions from the terrified regents. Richard, only 14, rode out to meet them at Mile End, promising amnesty, but betrayal followed swiftly. Tyler was killed in cold blood, the rebellion crushed, and many ringleaders punished brutally. The revolt exposed the fragility of royal authority and foreshadowed the constitutional struggles to come. Richard II came of age in a court rife with favoritism. He lavished patronage on his confidants, Robert de Vere, Michael de la Pole, sparked envy and rebellion among the lords appellant, who demanded the king's evil counselors be banished or executed. In 1388, the merciless parliament saw Richard's allies tried and condemned. De la Pole died in exile. De Vere fled. By 1397, the king had regained power and turned vindictive, executing several former rebels and exiling others on trumped-up charges. England teetered on the edge of civil war. Then, in 1399, Richard made a fateful decision. He crossed to Ireland to quash a minor rebellion, leaving the realm in the hands of his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Lancaster. Henry, exiled by Richard the previous year, returned instead to seize his inheritance, and soon the throne itself. With little bloodshed, Richard was forced to abdicate and was quietly escorted to Pontefract Castle, where he died in captivity, likely murdered, though chroniclers disagree on method. Thus ended the direct Plantagenet line and began the Lancastrian dynasty under Henry IV. A usurper king, Henry IV spent much of his reign quelling revolts, from the old Plantagenet loyalists to Welsh insurgent Owen Glendower, from the Percy family's uprisings in Northumberland to the conspiracy led by the Earl of Southampton. Henry's piety and patronage of the church earned him moral authority, but his financial struggles and health woes, he suffered from a mysterious malady in his later years, undermined his grip on power. When Henry IV died in 1413, he left his story unfinished and the throne to his young son, Henry V. The new king was determined to vindicate his line by uniting England under a banner of success. By 1415, he had assembled an army and landed in France, claiming to enforce his great-grandfather Edward III's rights. At Agincourt on October 25th, under gray skies and in a muddy field, Henry's vastly outnumbered forces inflicted a crushing defeat on the French nobility. English longbowmen tore through armored knights. The French Dauphin was forced to watch his comrades writhe in mud. Henry's speech to his troops, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers," would echo through the centuries. Agincourt was only the beginning. Over the next 7 years, Henry besieged Harfleur, forged alliances with Burgundians, and in 1420 negotiated the Treaty of Troyes. In that landmark agreement, Charles VI of France recognized Henry V as his heir, disinheriting his own son. The bold gambit seemed to promise a dual monarchy, but fate intervened. Henry died of dysentery in 1422 at Vincennes, just months before Charles VI's own death. Henry V was lauded as the ideal medieval warrior king, pious yet martial, generous yet ruthless. His victories revived national pride and gave England hope of continental supremacy. But with his death, his infant son Henry VI inherited a throne in name only, and the fragile seeds of union between England and France would soon wither. This concludes our second chapter in the saga of Britain's monarchs, the rise and fall of Plantagenet glory, the birth of Lancastrian ambition, and the fleeting triumph of Henry V. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll explore the turbulent minority of Henry VI, the Wars of the Roses, and the remarkable Tudor ascendancy that would reshape England's destiny once more. Picture this: a boy king swaddled in silk robes, too young to hold a sword, yet destined to inherit a fractured realm. Rival armies clash at his command, while whispers of madness swirl in his court. In the next few minutes, you'll witness how minority, madness, and ambition ignited England's bloodiest dynastic war, and how that war would clear the path for a new dynasty bathed in Tudor red. Stick around. History's most epic family feud is about to unfold. In the chill winter of 1422, just 9 months after the untimely death of Henry V, his infant son became king as Henry VI. At mere weeks old, the crown sat heavy on the newborn's brow. Regents and councils vied for power, each seeing the child as a puppet. The realm's confidence faltered. France, once conquered by Henry V, smelled opportunity. Within 2 years, Rouen fell, and Normandy slipped away. England's grip on its French territories weakened under weak regency and relentless French resurgence. Meanwhile, at home, the lack of a strong monarch emboldened rival factions among the nobility, setting the stage for internecine struggle. By 1437, Henry VI reached his majority. At 15, he took personal rule, but the boy king was ill-suited for command. Gentle and pious, he shunned politics for prayer and pageantry. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, emerged as his de facto partner in rule. A shrewd Italian princess with fire in her veins, Margaret became the kingdom's driving force. As she bore the king a son, Edward of Westminster, nobles split into factions, those loyal to Lancaster and Margaret, and those who felt the king's weakness risked England's very existence. Tensions exploded in 1453 when Henry VI suffered a catastrophic mental breakdown, plunging the state into crisis. For 16 months, the king lay catatonic. He forgot his own name and the nature of rulership. In his place, Richard, Duke of York, descendant of Edward III through a cadet branch, assumed the protectorate. Richard governed firmly. He strengthened the treasury, quelled uprisings in Wales and Scotland, and negotiated with foreign powers. Many saw in him the strong hand England desperately needed, but Margaret and her Lancastrian allies branded him a usurper, vowing to protect the young prince's birthright. When Henry VI regained his wits in late 1454, the regency ended, but the damage was irreversible. The Duke of York refused to surrender his power quietly. In February 1455, armed men clashed at St. Albans, the first battle in what would be called the Wars of the Roses. The Yorkists struck first, capturing Henry VI and killing his key Lancastrian commander, Edmund Beaufort. Yet the young king was spared, and the victory only deepened the feud. Over the next decade, England was ravaged by pitched battles, betrayals, and shifting allegiances, each victory sometimes as hollow as the next. At Wakefield in December 1460, the Lancaster faction dealt York a crushing blow. The Duke of York fell in battle, his head displayed on a pike at Micklegate Bar in York City, crowned mockingly with paper. Yet the flame of his claim lived on through his son Edward, Earl of March. In March 1461, Edward defeated Margaret's forces at Towton, one of the bloodiest battles on English soil. Under swirling snow and swirling steel, long bowmen shattered Lancaster ranks. Thousands lay dead in the North Yorkshire fields, and Edward strode into London to be proclaimed King Edward IV, displacing Henry VI once more. Edward IV's first reign, 1461 to 1470, ushered in a period of relative stability. A charismatic leader, he balanced martial prowess with courtly grace. His marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner and widow, angered many nobles, including the Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, who had orchestrated Edward's rise. Warwick's resentment led him to switch sides. He allied with Margaret in 1470, routing Edward in battle and restoring Henry VI. For just 9 months, the haunted king returned to the throne amid cheers in London streets. But Edward fled to Burgundy, raised an army, and in April 1471 he crushed Warwick at Barnet. 2 weeks later, he defeated a Lancastrian army at Tewkesbury, where Prince Edward fell in his mother's arms. By May, Henry VI was dead, probably murdered in the Tower, ending the Lancastrian line's hopes. Edward IV reclaimed his crown and reigned until 1483, presiding over prosperity, patronizing the arts, and securing his dynasty's future. But on April 9, 1483, he died suddenly, leaving 12-year-old Edward V in his place. The young king was escorted to the Tower of London, ostensibly for his coronation. Yet his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, governed in his stead, and had both Edward and his younger brother mysteriously disappear. In June, Parliament declared Richard king, crowning him Richard III. The fate of the princes in the Tower remains one of history's darkest mysteries, their bodies never found but their ghost haunting the English imagination. Richard III's brief reign, 1483 to 1485, proved a lightning rod for rebellion. Though a seasoned soldier and administrator, his ascent by usurpation alienated many Northerners and Southerners alike. In 1484, Henry Tudor, descendant of the Lancastrian Beaufort line, fled from exile in Brittany, gathering a motley force of exiles, Welshmen, and disgruntled Yorkists. His claim was tenuous, but his enemies' unpopularity provided fertile ground for insurrection. In August 1485, their armies met at Bosworth Field under a sky heavy with portent. The Battle of Bosworth was swift and brutal. Richard III, seeing his standard flag fall, charged into the fray, determined to cut down Tudor himself, but his knights were few and his plan faltered. In a dramatic moment, one of his own barons, Lord Stanley, withheld support until Tudor's banner rose. Richard was cut down, supposedly crying out, "My horse! My horse! My kingdom for a horse!" The day belonged to Henry Tudor, who stood among the fallen, bloodied sword in hand. With Richard's death, the Plantagenet dynasty, direct and cadet lines alike, came to an end. Henry Tudor, crowned Henry VII, took care to unite the red rose of Lancaster with the white rose of York, symbolically binding the fractured nobility in the Tudor rose. His marriage to Elizabeth of York sealed the dynastic peace. Henry's reign, 1485 to 1509, would focus on shoring up royal finances, curtailing overmighty subjects, and establishing the Tudor state's foundations. He revived England's economy, enhanced the royal court's prestige, and set the stage for the religious upheaval his son would unleash. As Part 3 concludes, we have witnessed England's descent into civil war, the minority of a boy king, the rise and fall of Yorkist and Lancastrian claimants, and the climactic clash that ushered in England's last medieval dynasty. From Henry VI's fragile reign to Edward IV's dazzling court, from the mystery of the princes to the thunder at Bosworth, this chapter has tested loyalty, faith, and ambition itself. In our next and final segment, we'll explore the Tudors, a dynasty of reformers, rebels, and rulers whose legacies still shape Britain today. You won't want to miss how Henry VIII's break with Rome and Elizabeth I's golden age transformed England into a global power. Close your eyes and imagine the clang of armor echoing through the great halls of Hampton Court, the scent of incense lingering in the chapel as a towering king strides beneath tapestries of saints and martyrs. And in the next few minutes, we'll uncover how a Tudor monarch shattered centuries of tradition to redefine what it meant to rule England. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll see how love, faith, and ruthless ambition collided to birth a global superpower, and how one queen's golden reign still inspires awe today. Henry VII entered London on that fog-shrouded morning of October 30th, 1485, a usurper wearing Lancastrian green and Yorkist white. His victory at Bosworth won him the crown, but it was his political cunning that forged the Tudor dynasty. Henry married Elizabeth of York to unite warring houses, cementing peace with a symbolic Tudor rose. Behind the velvet curtain, he tightened financial screws. Bonds, recognizances, and feudal dues became tools to keep unruly nobles in line. He revived the Court of Star Chamber, a secret tribunal where even the highest magnate could be judged. By 1509, England's coffers brimmed, its monarchy stable, and Henry VII breathed his last, leaving a realm far more secure than the one he'd inherited. His son, Henry VIII, burst onto the stage in 1509 with swagger and appetite. Tall, athletic, and handsome, the young king personified Renaissance royalty. He jousted in public tournaments, hunted deer in windswept forests, and presided over glittering banquets where minstrels played under chandeliers of polished brass. Yet behind the pageantry, Henry's ambitions would shake Christendom to its core. In 1521, he penned a treatise defending Catholic doctrine, earning the title Defender of the Faith from Pope Leo X. But by the late 1520s, his devotion collided with desire. Obsessed with producing a male heir, He grew desperate after decades of marriage to Catherine of Aragon yielded only one surviving child, Mary. When she failed to give him a son, Henry turned to canon law, seeking an annulment on the grounds that Catherine's prior marriage to his brother made their union uncanonical. Pope Clement VII, trapped between Charles V's power and papal politics, stalled, and Henry, never one to take no for an answer, broke with Rome. In 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, declaring the king only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. With that stroke, Henry dissolved monasteries, confiscated their vast lands, and redistributed their riches to loyal courtiers. The dissolution of the monasteries uprooted centuries of religious life. Monks and nuns evicted, shrines smashed, and medieval manuscripts burned. Yet from the ashes arose a new English identity, Protestant in doctrine, loyal to the crown, and eager to embrace the printing press. Henry's matrimonial saga became legend. Anne Boleyn, the dark-haired lady-in-waiting, captivated him with wit and charm. They married in 1533, and Elizabeth was born that September, destined to become one of England's greatest monarchs. But Anne bore only a daughter, and her failure to produce a son spelled her doom. In 1536, she was arrested, charged with adultery, witchcraft, and treason. On May 19th, before a silent Tower Green, her head fell, and Henry marched on to wife number 3, Jane Seymour, who finally bore him a son, Edward, in 1537. Jane's death soon after gave Henry cause for both mourning and suspicion. The next decade saw him wed 3 more times, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr, each marriage reflecting shifting alliances and personal whims. Through it all, Henry expanded royal authority, the Privy Council grew, regional councils enforced law and order, and royal proclamations carried the force of statute. Foreign policy alternated between war with France and uneasy peace with Scotland, most famously at the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520, where Henry and Francis I of France dueled in gold-trimmed pavilions. By the time Henry VIII died in 1547, England had been transformed. The medieval world was gone, replaced by a nascent modern state where the king's word was law. The church answered to the crown, and Englishmen read the Bible in their own tongue. But Henry's legacy was mixed, a church fractured, royal finances strained by war, and the succession clouded by the youth of his son, Edward VI. Edward VI, crowned at 9, was a sickly boy schooled in Protestant doctrine. His reign, 1547 to 1553, accelerated religious change. Conservative clergy were expelled, English replaced Latin at services, and the Book of Common Prayer united worship across the land. Yet the young king's health waned, and on his deathbed he named his cousin Lady Jane Grey as his successor, an attempt by powerful nobles to exclude his Catholic half-sister Mary. But the council and the commons rallied to Mary's banner, toppling Jane in 9 days. Lady Jane's brief reign earned her the moniker 9-Day Queen, and her tragic execution underscored the volatility of Tudor politics. Mary I, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, ascended in 1553 determined to reverse her father's reforms. She married Philip II of Spain, forging an unpopular Catholic alliance. In 1554, Wyatt's rebellion erupted, fueled by xenophobia and fear of Spanish dominance. Mary crushed the revolt and proclaimed herself queen in triumph. She then set about restoring papal authority. Papist bishops returned, Protestant preachers exiled, and over 300 reformers burned at the stake in what became known as the Marian persecutions. Her reign left a bitter religious divide, and her death in 1558 restored Protestantism under her half-sister. Elizabeth the Reversed took the throne at 25, a queen tempered by exile and betrayal. With prudence and charisma, she navigated religious tensions. The Act of Uniformity in 1559 established a moderate Protestant church, while the 39 Articles defined doctrine. Elizabeth cultivated a court filled with music, poetry, and intrigue, spying on Catholics with her network of agents under Sir Francis Walsingham, and patronizing playwrights such as Marlowe and the young Shakespeare. Foreign threats loomed. Catholic Europe eyed England's break with Rome. In 1587, Elizabeth sanctioned the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, her cousin and Catholic figurehead. Months later, Philip II assembled the Spanish Armada, a vast fleet meant to annihilate England. In August 1588, under brooding skies, English ships, swifter and more maneuverable, harassed the Armada in the Channel. Fire ships scattered the Spanish, and a storm off Calais scattered the rest. When dawn broke, the Great Armada was in ruins, its mission a catastrophe. England's naval victory secured her realm and heralded the rise of English sea power. Elizabeth's reign, often called the Golden Age, saw the flourishing of exploration. Sir Walter Raleigh planted the Roanoke colony on the shores of North America. Sir Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe, and adventurers like Humphrey Gilbert carved paths to the New World. Back home, wool and textile trade expanded, London's population boomed, and the arts reached new heights. Yet Elizabeth navigated age and health with grace, refusing marriage proposals to preserve her authority as the Virgin Queen. By her death on March 24, 1603, she had reigned 44 years, leaving England secure, prosperous, and on the cusp of empire. With Elizabeth's passing, the Tudor age ended and the Stuart dynasty began under James I, but the Tudor legacy endured, a strengthened monarchy, a national church, and an English identity forged in fire and faith. From Henry VII's cunning diplomacy to Henry VIII's seismic break with Rome, from Edward VI's youthful zeal to Elizabeth I's golden triumph, the Tudor monarchs shaped a nation that would soon change the world. And that, my friends, is every British monarch from 1066 to 1603. Conquerors, reformers, warriors, poets, and visionaries, whose ambitions and passions crafted the England we know today. If you enjoyed this journey through time, hit like, subscribe, and ring that bell so you won't miss our next deep dive into history's greatest stories. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay curious. The cobblestone streets of London tremble under the march of musketeers, banners snapping in the wind, while high above, King Charles I watches from a palace window, unaware that within a decade, he'll stand alone on a makeshift scaffold, his very head set to fall into a waiting basket. In the next few minutes, you'll travel through betrayal, civil war, and a trial that tore a nation apart, and see how a king's unwavering belief in divine right led to the blade that ended his reign and his life. Stick around, because this is only the beginning of our journey through history's most infamous decapitations. Charles Stuart assumed the English throne in March 1625 at the age of 25, inheriting a kingdom scarred by religious tensions and political friction. His father, James I, had united the crowns of England and Scotland, but had also sown distrust by insisting on absolute monarchy. No bishop, no king, he'd declared, linking royal authority and episcopal hierarchy. When Charles succeeded, Parliament bristled at his lavish spending, his penchant for foreign wars, and his secret dealings with Catholic powers. In his very first speech, Charles proclaimed himself Prince without a peer, setting the stage for a collision course with those who believed no monarch should be above the law. Almost immediately, Charles's relationship with Parliament deteriorated. He dissolved it twice in his first 3 years, raising funds through forced loans and controversial taxes like ship money, a levy traditionally confined to coastal defense, now imposed on every county inland and out. As men in black and gray cloaks emptied their purses, whispers spread of evil counselors in the king's ear. The Duke of Buckingham, a flamboyant favorite whose influence over Charles seemed to eclipse even royal blood, and George Villiers, whose rumored personal intimacy with the king inflamed Puritan sermons. By 1639, rebellion had broken out in Scotland. The Scots, angered by Charles's attempt to impose the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, signed the National Covenant and marched on Carlisle. Charles, humiliated and bankrupt, summoned Parliament again to raise an army. But the House of Commons seethed at his demands. When 6 lords denounced the king's advisors, Charles retorted that he would have subjects cut to pieces rather than yield to such insolence. As negotiations failed, the so-called bishops' wars ended in English defeat and a staggering debt. Frustrated both by revolt and empty coffers, Charles embarked on the personal rule, 11 years without Parliament. From his palace at Hampton Court and then Oxford, he presided over a court that balanced regal splendor with ruthless administration. Laud, his Archbishop of Canterbury, enforced uniform worship with inquisitorial zeal. Dissenters were fined, imprisoned, or exiled, Embroiderers stitched visions of royal glory onto tapestries while cruel physical punishments echoed in town squares. Some saw a renaissance of court culture, masks, art, and music chaired by French ambassadors. But beneath the finery lay growing resentment. Shopkeepers whispered that the king had become the man of blood, a monarch more interested in revenue than justice. When the Scots invaded again in 1640, this time joining forces with the English opposition, dreaded Charles faced ruin. Desperate for funds, he convened the Long Parliament, a body that would not be dismissed until it had seized royal power. Scottish General Leslie's army was at the gates of Durham. Irish rebels, stoked by religious persecution, ravaged Ulster, and English merchants, angry at trade restrictions, joined calls for reform. Under the leadership of John Pym, Parliament pressed for extraordinary measures, the Triennial Act ensuring it met every 3 years, impeachment of Laud, and the dismantling of the king's prerogative courts. The pendulum had swung. England's ruler now answered to a body he could not control. The spark that ignited civil war came in January 1642. Charles, desperate to assert authority, rode to the House of Commons with armed guards to arrest 5 members accused of treason. The chamber was empty, the 5 had escaped, and the king, betrayed and furious, declared that he would make war upon Parliament. He raised his standard at Nottingham on August 22nd, and the first shots of the English Civil War shattered the fragile peace. For the next 5 years, England bled. Royalist cavaliers, satin-clad and plumed, charged under the command of Prince Rupert, leaving fields strewn with muskets and broken pikes. Parliament's Roundheads, driven by Puritan zeal and led by Oliver Cromwell's ironclad New Model Army, met them in pitched battles. Edgehill, Marston Moor, Naseby. At Naseby in 1645, Cromwell's cavalry broke the king's right wing, capturing war chests and letters that revealed Charles's secret negotiations with Irish and foreign Catholic forces. The people's fury turned red and white. Parliamentary standards swept the battlefield. By 1646, Charles was a prisoner. He had surrendered to the Scots at Newark, hoping for leniency, only to be handed over to Parliament for a fee. Locked first at Holdenby House and then at Carisbrooke Castle on the Isle of Wight, he attempted cunning maneuvers, pitting Presbyterians against independents, promising toleration to one side while offering concessions to another. But his words rang hollow. In his own speeches, he claimed divine right and refused to accept any settlement that implied royal accountability. Kings are not to be bound by any statutes, he insisted, as hunger and frustration gnawed at public support. Peace talks at Newport in 1648 proved futile. A faction of army officers, emboldened by their victories and outraged by Charles's duplicity, marched on Parliament in the Pride's Purge, ejecting all who favored leniency. What remained was the Rump Parliament, a single-minded assembly that would try the king for high treason against his people. In December 1648, a High Court of Justice was established, a panel of 59 commissioners, nobility mingled with merchants, priests, and soldiers, sworn to hold Charles accountable. At Westminster Hall on January 20th, 1649, Charles entered the courtroom, tall and composed, dressed in black with a white band around his waist. He refused to acknowledge the court's legitimacy. "I was never, nor am I now, guilty of any act deserving death," yet maintained a regal dignity that unnerved his judges. When asked to plead, he replied, "Not guilty of the crimes laid to my charge," before demanding proof of the court's jurisdiction. William Lenthal, the Speaker of the Commons, famously retorted, "May it please your Majesty, I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak in this place, but as this House is pleased to direct me." The tension between Crown and Commons crystallized. In that moment, the king had been dethroned by his own subjects. Over the following days, witnesses recounted Charles's secret correspondence with Irish rebels and French troops, his wars waged at the cost of English blood and treasure, his dissolution of parliaments. Charles listened impassively, his face a mask. On January 27th, the court pronounced its sentence. The king must die by the laws of this kingdom for betraying his trust and waging war on his own people. The morning of January 30th, 1649, dawned cold and gray. Thousands lined Whitehall, silent as a tomb, to witness the execution. Charles rode in an open carriage, dressed in a black velvet coat richly embroidered, and wearing 2 shirts to ward off the chill. Some say he feared trembling under the eyes of his enemies, others that he hoped to die unmarred by tears. Mounted on the scaffold, he addressed the crowd in clear, measured tones. "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be, no disturbance in the world." He asked forgiveness of any he had offended, then laid his head upon the block. At the signal, the executioner swept the axe down. One blow, swift, almost silent, and the king's head separated from his shoulders, rolling into the red basket. The crowd gasped as the executioner lifted the severed head by the hair and displayed it to the onlookers. 23 strokes of the axe and the English monarchy lay in pieces, its divine mandate shattered. In the weeks that followed, Parliament proclaimed England a commonwealth, abolishing the throne and the House of Lords. Cromwell rose to power, eventually becoming Lord Protector, a ruler in all but name. But the memory of Charles's martyrdom lingered. Royalists whispered of the king over the water in exile. Poets penned elegies to his fall. Churches kept his head as a relic. 11 years later, the Restoration would bring his son, Charles II, back to the throne. But the lesson endured. No king, however anointed, was immune to the will of the people. So ends part 1 of our exploration into the world of monarchs who literally lost their heads. We've witnessed the rise and fall of Charles I, a king whose belief in absolute power met the blade of justice, forever altering the relationship between ruler and subject. In part 2, we'll turn our gaze across the channel to the glittering courts of Versailles, where Louis XVI's fate would echo Charles's in a revolution even more violent, and where the echoes of that execution would reverberate through Europe. You won't want to miss how a cobbler's son became king, married an Austrian archduchess, and ultimately found himself guillotined before a roaring crowd. Until then, stay curious. If you thought the fall of Charles I was shocking, wait until you hear what happened in France a century later. Imagine the most powerful king in Europe, dressed in gold, living in the sprawling palace of Versailles, brought down by bread riots and angry pamphlets. And imagine this, a monarch so indecisive, so blind to revolution, that he literally signed his own death warrant. That's where we're going next. This is the story of how Louis XVI, the Sun King's grandson, lost not just his throne, but his head, and how his blood stained the very soil of Paris. Louis Auguste was born in 1754 into the gilded world of the French Bourbon. As the second son of the Dauphin, no one expected him to rule, but smallpox and early death shifted fate. At just 11, he became the heir to the most powerful kingdom in Europe. His grandfather, Louis XV, had reigned for nearly 60 years, but his court was riddled with decadence, mistresses, and financial mismanagement. By the time Louis XVI inherited the crown in 1774, France was bankrupt in everything but illusion. At 19, Louis married Marie Antoinette, the glamorous daughter of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. The union was meant to strengthen the alliance between France and Austria, but instead it became a lightning rod for scandal. Marie was young, beautiful, and foreign, a deadly combination in the paranoid corridors of Versailles. As France starved, she threw lavish balls, wore diamonds the size of plums, and built a mock village on palace grounds to play milkmaid. The people whispered. They called her Madame Deficit. Louis, meanwhile, was ill-suited to kingship. He was shy, bookish, and fascinated by locks and locksmithing. While nobles jockeyed for influence, he tinkered with keys in his study. When revolution began stirring in the streets of Paris, he had no idea how to respond. The American War of Independence, which France supported out of spite for Britain, pushed the country deeper into debt. Food prices soared. Bread lines stretched for miles. The Estates General, a legislative body dormant for over 175 years, was summoned in 1789. The old order was about to collapse. The meeting of the Estates General opened a Pandora's box. The Third Estate, commoners, and the rising bourgeoisie broke away and declared themselves the National Assembly. On July 14, 1789, the storming of the Bastille became a symbol of rebellion. Louis called it a riot. It was a revolution. Within months, feudalism was abolished, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man proclaimed equality and liberty for all. But the king remained, hesitating, resisting, vacillating. His lack of leadership became a weapon in the revolutionaries' hands. In October 1789, a mob of women marched from Paris to Versailles, demanding bread. They broke into the palace, murdered guards, and forced Louis and Marie to return to Paris. Their carriage moved slowly through the streets, surrounded by thousands, while pikes bearing decapitated heads swayed in the wind. They were now prisoners in the Tuileries Palace, monarchs in name only. In 1791, the royal family attempted to flee. Disguised as servants, they set off in a heavy carriage toward the border. But at Varennes, they were recognized. Louis, fat and slow, was spotted by a postmaster who had seen his face on coins. The king was arrested and brought back to Paris in disgrace. Any remaining illusion that he ruled by divine right shattered in that moment. From then on, he was no longer Louis XVI, but Louis Capet, citizen and traitor. The radicals gained momentum. Robespierre, Danton, and Marat pushed for a republic. The Jacobins called for the king's execution. In September 1792, the monarchy was officially abolished. Louis was tried by the National Convention for treason. The evidence was overwhelming. Secret letters, attempts to enlist foreign armies, and double dealing with Austria and Prussia. The courtroom was filled with a tense silence as the deputies voted. The result, 361 to 360. Louis would die. On January 21st, 1793, Paris awoke in a strange stillness. Armed guards lined the streets. The king, now simply Citizen Louis Capet, rode in a cart to the Place de la Révolution. He wore a plain white shirt and walked calmly to the scaffold. A priest whispered prayers in his ear. He turned to the crowd and declared, "I die innocent of the crimes imputed to me. I pardon those who have occasioned my death." Then he stretched his arms and laid his head beneath the guillotine. The blade fell in one swift motion. A fountain of blood sprayed the wooden platform. The executioner held up the severed head, and for a moment, silence. Then came a roar. 1,000 fists raised in victory, a symbol of old tyranny, destroyed. Some dipped their handkerchiefs in the king's blood as souvenirs. Others claimed the earth itself trembled. It was not just a monarch who had died, but an era. Yet the revolution didn't stop. If anything, Louis's death accelerated the terror. Marie Antoinette, now a widow and reviled even more than her husband, was dragged before a revolutionary tribunal. Her trial was a farce. Accused of incest, waste, and treason, she stood pale but defiant. "I appeal to all mothers," she cried when accused of abusing her son. On October 16, 1793, she too mounted the scaffold. Her last words, directed at the executioner after stepping on his foot, were, "Pardon me, monsieur, I did not do it on purpose." The guillotine became a national symbol. In just 1 year, over 16,000 people were executed across France. Heads rolled daily. Nobles, priests, scientists, even revolutionaries themselves. The reign of terror had begun. But in time, the tide turned. Robespierre himself was guillotined. The terror exhausted itself and France stumbled toward stability. Napoleon Bonaparte rose from the chaos, crowning himself emperor in 1804. The monarchy would return, briefly and in strange diminished forms, but never again with the divine grandeur of Louis XIV or the old Bourbons. So why does Louis XVI's execution matter? Because it marked the moment when kingship was no longer sacred, when a man born to rule could be judged by his people, stripped of power, dignity, and finally, life. The age of monarchs had begun to die with the clang of the guillotine, and the age of revolution had begun. In part 3, we'll turn our attention eastward, to a Russian Tsar whose rule ended not in a courtroom, but in a dark basement soaked in gunpowder and secrets. Nicholas II's fate would be sealed not by revolution alone, but by the ghosts of Rasputin, the screams of starving peasants, and the whispers of a cursed dynasty. You won't want to miss the last Romanov's final moments, and the strange mystery that still surrounds his missing daughter. See you there. If you thought the guillotine was brutal, wait until you hear how the Russian Tsar was executed, not in a palace or public square, but in a dark, blood-soaked basement. A king who ruled over 1/6 of the earth, whose family lineage stretched back centuries, reduced in a single night to ashes and bones in the woods. This is the story of Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, and how his entire family vanished in a storm of bullets and fire. Nicholas II was never meant to be a revolutionary figure. In fact, he was the exact opposite, a conservative monarch deeply devoted to tradition, the Orthodox Church, and the belief that his authority came from God alone. Born in 1868, Nicholas ascended the throne in 1894 after the death of his father, Alexander III, a powerful and iron-fisted ruler. Nicholas, by contrast, was mild-mannered, indecisive, and utterly unprepared for the weight of empire. As he later admitted in his diary, "I am not ready to be a czar." But history did not wait for Nicholas to be ready. His reign began in tragedy. During his coronation festivities, over 1,000 people were trampled to death in Moscow's Kodinka field while scrambling for gifts and food. Nicholas insisted on continuing the celebrations, and the public never forgot. It was a bad omen, and worse was coming. At the heart of the Russian Empire's instability was inequality on a staggering scale. While Nicholas and his family lived in opulent palaces, the vast majority of Russians were impoverished peasants. Cities like St. Petersburg were overcrowded and starving, and industrial workers labored in horrific conditions. The people wanted reform, land, labor rights, and a voice in their government. Nicholas offered none. In 1905, the first storm broke. Peaceful protesters led by a priest marched toward the Winter Palace to present a petition. They carried icons and sang hymns. Nicholas was not present, but his soldiers opened fire anyway. Hundreds were killed in what would become known as Bloody Sunday. The event shattered the myth of the benevolent czar. The empire erupted in riots, strikes, and mutiny. Nicholas reluctantly agreed to form a parliament, the Duma, but constantly undermined its power. He trusted only his inner circle and clung to autocracy. Meanwhile, a new force was growing in the shadows, the revolutionary Bolsheviks, led by a brilliant, ruthless exile named Vladimir Lenin. But Nicholas had another problem, or rather, a curse. His only son and heir, Alexei, was born with hemophilia. The disease made the boy bleed uncontrollably from even the smallest injury. Doctors could do nothing. Into this desperate void stepped a strange and mesmerizing figure, Grigory Rasputin, a peasant, mystic, and self-proclaimed holy man. Rasputin somehow eased the boy's suffering, likely through calm and hypnotic suggestion. The Tsarina, Alexandra, believed he was sent by God. Rasputin quickly gained enormous influence at court, to the horror of the nobility and public. He was foul-smelling, womanizing, and whispered to be the real ruler of Russia. Cartoons showed him as a puppet master controlling the Tsarina, with Nicholas depicted as a clueless shadow. The scandal surrounding Rasputin deepened the monarchy's decline. During World War I, Nicholas made the disastrous decision to lead the Russian army himself, leaving Alexandra and Rasputin in charge at home. Russia's army, poorly supplied and led, suffered devastating losses. The economy collapsed. Millions starved. Entire regiments deserted. By 1917, the empire was crumbling. In February, protests in Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, exploded into revolution. Soldiers refused to fire on the crowds and joined them instead. The Duma declared a provisional government. Nicholas, isolated in his train carriage, abdicated the throne. 3 centuries of Romanov rule ended with a hurried signature on a piece of paper. At first, the family was placed under house arrest. Then came the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, who overthrew the provisional government in the October Revolution. Civil war erupted. Fearing that the Tsar could become a rallying symbol for counter-revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks made a terrible decision, one that would echo through history. In the early hours of July 17, 1918, Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, and 4 loyal attendants were awakened in their prison house in Ekaterinburg. They were told they were being moved. The family dressed quickly and descended into a dimly lit basement. There, the execution squad waited. The commander read a short statement. "Your relatives have tried to save you. They have failed. You must be shot." Nicholas barely had time to reply. "What?" Before the gunfire began. It was chaos. The bullets ricocheted off the walls. The daughters screamed. The hemophiliac Alexei sat silently, confused. The soldiers had not expected the women's corsets, lined with hidden jewels, to act like armor, deflecting bullets. They were shot again, and again. Bayonets were used. It took 20 minutes to kill everyone. The bodies were loaded onto trucks, dumped in a forest, doused in acid, and buried in shallow graves. The killers tried to hide the crime, but rumors spread fast. The royal family's fate was denied, then confirmed, then denied again. Decades of conspiracy followed. Was Anastasia still alive? Had Alexei escaped? Movies, novels, and imposters fueled the legend. But in the 1990s, the truth emerged. The bones of Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 daughters were discovered and DNA tested. Later, the remains of Alexei and Maria were found nearby. They were buried with full honors in 1998 in St. Petersburg by a post-Soviet Russia trying to make peace with its past. In 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized the family as martyrs. Nicholas II's execution marked the end of not just a dynasty, but a world. No other European monarch fell with such totality. His entire bloodline was erased in one night, and yet his fall was not unlike others. He was a king who failed to adapt, who refused to bend, and who was broken by the weight of history. Next time, in Part 4, we travel further back to the Middle Ages, to a realm of betrayal, ambition, and divine justice. We'll meet a Scottish king betrayed by his closest ally, a Danish ruler assassinated in a chapel, and an English king who fell to the very people he once ruled with an iron fist. You think regicide was rare? Think again. See you there. Hey guys, imagine being crowned by God, revered by your people, feared by your enemies, only to have your head split open by a sword, in a church. The truth is, kings were never safe, not even in sacred places. In this final part, we're going deep into medieval Europe to uncover the stories of monarchs who lost not just their crowns, but their lives in some of the most shocking betrayals of their time. This is not fairy tale royalty. This is blood, steel, and divine punishment. Let's start with Saint Olaf of Norway, a king turned martyr. Olaf Haraldsson ruled Norway in the early 11th century and was obsessed with unifying the kingdom under Christianity. He burned pagan temples, executed dissenters, and fought viciously to centralize power. For his efforts, he was loved by some and loathed by many more. In 1028, Olaf was driven into exile by his own nobles, but he wasn't done yet. In 1030, he returned to reclaim his throne with a small army. What happened next is now legend. At the Battle of Stiklestad, Olaf's forces were outnumbered. As the fighting raged, Olaf was struck down, first in the leg, then by a sword to the neck, and finally a spear to the heart. His blood soaked the battlefield. His reign ended, but his myth began. In the years after his death, strange miracles were reported at his burial site. His corpse didn't decay. Blind men claimed to see. The church declared him a saint, and he became a national symbol. But the truth remains, Olaf lost his kingdom, and his head, to the very people he tried to rule in God's name. Then there's Knut Lavard of Denmark, a nobleman with a legitimate claim to the throne. He was young, charismatic, and popular among both the Danes and the Slavs. Too popular. His cousin Magnus the Strong saw him as a threat. In 1131, Magnus lured Knut into a forest near Ringsted under the pretense of peace talks. There, without trial or ceremony, Knut was murdered, hacked to death with an axe. His body was left in the snow. The assassination sparked a civil war that lasted decades. But just like Olaf, Knut's death elevated him to sainthood, and in death, he achieved what he never could in life: immortality. But what about England? Surely in such a powerful kingdom, kings would be safer, not even close. Let's talk about King Edmund Ironside, who ruled England briefly in 1016 during the Viking invasions. His nickname came from his reputation for incredible bravery and resistance against the invading Danes. He fought battle after battle against King Knut the Great, eventually agreeing to divide the kingdom. But only weeks later, Edmund was dead. And the cause? That depends on which version you believe. One chronicler claimed he was stabbed while relieving himself in a latrine. Another says he was murdered in his sleep by traitors. Either way, Knut inherited the whole kingdom. The name Ironside may have described his courage, but even steel couldn't save him from betrayal. And now, the most infamous of all medieval regicides, King Edward II of England. Edward was never a popular king. He was more interested in his male favorites, like Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser, than in ruling effectively. The nobles hated his favoritism. The Queen, Isabella of France, hated him too. When she allied with her lover, Roger Mortimer, they led a rebellion in 1326 and forced Edward to abdicate. He was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, and soon after, he died. But how? Here's where history turns horrifying. The most popular and most debated account says that Edward was murdered by having a red-hot poker inserted into his body through the rear, burning his internal organs while leaving no visible mark. The story may be apocryphal, designed to shock and shame, but it spread like wildfire across Europe. Even if the details are embellished, Edward's end was undoubtedly grim. A king destroyed not on the battlefield, but in secret, by his own wife and her lover. Let's move to Scotland and the tale of King James I, a ruler who believed in absolute monarchy, high taxes, and centralized control. He was intelligent and cultured, but also paranoid and ruthless. He made many enemies, but his downfall came from within his own court. In 1437, while staying at a monastery in Perth, James was ambushed by conspirators led by Sir Robert Graham. The king attempted to flee through a hidden passage, only to find the exit had been sealed during renovations. He was trapped. Armed with swords and daggers, the assassins broke into his chamber. James fought back with a fireplace poker, but he was outnumbered. He was stabbed at least 16 times, left bleeding in the darkness while his wife screamed for help. His death sent shockwaves through the kingdom. It was a brutal, calculated hit, ordered by men who had once pledged their loyalty. Next is King Henri III of France, whose life ended in a monastery, but not in prayer. Henri was a king surrounded by crisis. France was torn by religious wars between Catholics and Huguenots. Henri, a Catholic himself, alienated his hardline allies by tolerating Protestants. He had already seen his brother assassinated, and the Radical Catholic League wanted him gone too. On August 1st, 1589, a fanatical monk named Jacques Clément gained access to the king under the pretense of delivering secret documents. As Henri read the letter, Clément plunged a dagger into his abdomen. The king cried out, "He has killed me!" and drew his sword. Guards burst in and killed the monk, but the damage was done. Henri died the next day. He became the last French king of the Valois dynasty, a king murdered not in war, but in quiet, by a man of the cloth. Across Europe, regicide became a whispered fear in every palace. Kings surrounded themselves with guards, poison testers, spies, but even the most protected monarch could fall. Wenceslaus III, the last of the Przemyslid kings of Bohemia, met a strange fate in 1306. While preparing for a military campaign, he was found stabbed to death in Olomouc, in modern-day Czech Republic. The killer was never caught. No one knew who ordered the murder, though some suspect a rival noble family. His death ended his dynasty entirely and plunged the region into chaos. Even Sweden wasn't safe. King Gustav III, a progressive ruler known for reforms and his flamboyant personality, was shot during a masquerade ball in 1792. The assassin, a nobleman angry at the king's absolute power, fired at point-blank range. Gustav survived for weeks but eventually died from infection. His death was immortalized in paintings, operas, and novels. It was stylish, but deadly. What unites all these kings, from Russia to France to Scandinavia, is that their power, even when it seemed limitless, was fragile. One dagger, one betrayal, one moment of weakness, and their crowns fell. And now, we end where it all began, with the myth of the untouchable king shattered. The divine right of kings, once believed to be absolute, proved to be little defense against steel and fire. History doesn't just remember those who wore the crown, but those who lost their heads while wearing it. Some were saints, some were tyrants, all were kings, and all lost their heads, literally. If you've made it this far, thank you for joining us on this journey through the blood-soaked corridors of royal history. There's still so much more to uncover. Queens who were poisoned in silence, emperors who vanished without a trace, and courts where every step could be your last. So stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember, even the mightiest monarchs bleed. Hey guys, picture this. A royal banquet suddenly turns into a trial. The king stares into space, muttering in Latin to invisible enemies. His courtiers freeze. One servant makes eye contact, and the king screams that he's possessed by demons. Guards drag the man away. This wasn't a scene from a movie. This was an ordinary Tuesday in the reign of a British monarch. Welcome to the dark, spiraling history of royal insanity, where crowns were passed between hands gripped by delusion, paranoia, and absolute madness, and today we're ranking them all. Let's start slow, but we won't stay sane for long. 15. Edward VIII, the romantic reckless. He wasn't hallucinating or drooling. No. Edward VIII's madness came in a different form: emotional obsession and catastrophic judgment. The year was 1936. Britain needed stability. Fascism was rising in Europe. But Edward didn't care about politics or power. He only wanted one thing: Wallis Simpson, an American, a divorcee, twice. And not just a fling. He was ready to give up everything for her. When his advisors begged him to reconsider, Edward snapped, "I intend to marry her, and if I cannot do that while being king, then I shall cease to be king." And he did. He abdicated the throne for love, something no English monarch had ever done. To some, it was romantic. To others, delusional. Afterward, Edward spent his life wandering through exile, throwing parties with former Nazis, dressing in military uniforms he never earned, and writing memoirs no one really read. It wasn't screaming madness, but it was royal recklessness with the power to shake an empire. 14. George IV, the delusional dandy. Now let's talk vanity, excess, and full-blown detachment from reality. George IV loved food, women, and gambling. He was obese by 40, addicted to laudanum, and deeply in debt, but that didn't stop him from believing he was the most dazzling man alive. He called himself the first gentleman of Europe. His subjects called him something else: the fat Adonis. George once claimed he'd led cavalry charges at Waterloo. He hadn't. He once declared that he'd designed all of Brighton Pavilion himself. He hadn't. And he swore his estranged wife, Caroline of Brunswick, was trying to poison him by staring at him too long during dinner. His paranoia made court life unbearable. Servants tiptoed around his tantrums. His favorite meals consisted of 14 courses, and that was just breakfast. Was George IV mad in the medical sense? Maybe not. But by the end, his imagination had completely replaced his reality. He lived in a fantasy, wrapped in velvet, drunk on power, and shoveling goose liver into his mouth with trembling fingers. 13. Richard II, the theatrical tyrant. Some kings went mad quietly. Richard II went mad dramatically. Crowned at age 10, he grew into a monarch obsessed with his divine right to rule, not as a responsibility, but as a performance. He walked barefoot through gardens to mimic Christ. He spoke in sermons. He ordered gold leaf to be added to his ceiling so that he could always sleep beneath heavenly light. But when challenged, Richard turned violent. After the peasants' revolt in 1381, he lured the rebel leaders to a meeting with promises of peace, then had them murdered on the spot. He executed noblemen for thinking treasonous thoughts. No one was safe, not even his own uncle, whom he starved to death in a dungeon. Eventually, his cousin Henry Bolingbroke invaded. Richard was deposed, imprisoned, and likely starved to death himself. The boy king who dreamed of sainthood died muttering alone in a cell. His madness wasn't just internal, it was political, theatrical, and terrifying. 12. Mary I, the burning fanatic. Mary Tudor's madness burned at the stake, literally. Daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, Mary grew up watching her mother cast aside, her faith mocked, and her name disgraced. When she finally took the throne, she saw her reign as divine retribution. She immediately reversed the Protestant reforms and reintroduced Catholicism by fire. Heresy was not a difference of opinion, it was a crime against God. Under her orders, 280 people were burned alive, including bishops, theologians, and even teenagers. Crowds watched in horror as flames consumed people screaming for mercy. Mary believed their deaths purified England, but behind the blood was a deeply broken woman. She suffered phantom pregnancies, convinced she could feel a baby kicking that wasn't there. She trusted her husband, Philip of Spain, who abandoned her, and she spent her final days alone, unloved, and utterly convinced she had saved England's soul. Was it madness, or just unyielding religious zeal? Maybe both. 11. James I, the obsessed demon hunter. Now we descend into the shadows, witches, demons, and the smell of sulfur. James I of England, and the 6th of Scotland, was intelligent, no doubt. He authorized the King James Bible. He debated theology with scholars. But he was also obsessed with the idea that Satan walked among us. After surviving a terrifying sea storm, James became convinced witches were trying to kill him. He launched witch hunts in Scotland, personally overseeing interrogations and tortures. He published a book, Demonology, which became a guide for European witch hunters. He believed women could fly, speak with the devil, and steal male genitals through sorcery. But his paranoia went beyond witches. James believed his enemies were trying to poison him constantly. He wore thick padded clothes to prevent dagger attacks and refused to open windows, fearing invisible assassins. Even food was suspect. He once forced a servant to taste a dish 6 times before daring to eat it himself. The king, who translated the Bible into English, also saw the demons in his closet. 10. Henry VI, the blank throne. No monarch in British history embodies the silent tragedy of madness quite like Henry VI. Crowned at 9 months old, Henry inherited the legacy of Henry V, the warrior king of Agincourt. But Henry VI was no warrior. He was shy, quiet, and painfully pious. He built schools and churches, not armies. And then he broke. In 1453, after hearing about a military defeat, Henry simply stopped functioning. For over a year, he didn't speak, didn't move, didn't recognize his wife or newborn son. He stared into space for hours, unresponsive to everything around him. Royal physicians were baffled. Eventually, he recovered, but he was never truly there. During the Wars of the Roses, Henry was a figurehead passed between factions like a cursed relic. Once, during captivity, he was found laughing to himself while wearing a paper crown. When his wife, Margaret of Anjou, tried to rally armies around him, nobles whispered that the king was a child trapped in a man's body. In 1471, Henry was imprisoned in the Tower of London. One night, he was found dead, reportedly of melancholy, but most historians believe he was murdered, likely smothered with a pillow. His madness wasn't theatrical, it was gentle, helpless, and it nearly destroyed a nation. 9. George III, the Mad King. You've heard the legend, the king who lost America, the man who spoke to trees, screamed at ghosts, and signed documents upside down. George III is perhaps the most famous Mad King in British history, but the truth is more tragic than comedic. In 1788, George began experiencing terrifying mental breakdowns. He spoke non-stop for hours, his words slurred and disconnected. He foamed at the mouth. He claimed he could speak with angels, and once tried to shake hands with an oak tree, believing it was the king of Prussia. His doctors tortured him in the name of treatment. They blistered his skin, strapped him to chairs, and isolated him for weeks. The public mocked him. Plays were written about his madness. His own son was appointed regent. Modern scientists believe George III suffered from porphyria, a genetic blood disorder causing both physical and mental symptoms, but in his time, he was seen as cursed. His final years were spent completely blind, deaf, and insane, wandering the halls of Windsor Castle, humming hymns to himself, clutching at nothing. Let's descend deeper now, because what comes next isn't just royal eccentricity, it's full-blown breakdown, hallucinations, blood-soaked visions, sudden executions. These monarchs didn't just flirt with madness, they danced with it, ruled through it, and dragged entire kingdoms into their psychological abyss. Alcatraz 8, Charles VI of France, bonus madness, but it hits Britain too. Okay, this isn't a British monarch, but he's important. Charles VI of France was Queen Isabella's brother. Why does that matter? Because through him, madness bled across the channel into England's own royal veins. Charles believed he was made of glass, literally. He wrapped himself in padded clothes so he wouldn't shatter. He once attacked his own knights in the forest because he thought they were enemies sent by the devil. He ran through the trees screaming until he collapsed. For days, he didn't recognize his wife or children. Now here's where Britain comes in. His daughter, Catherine of Valois, married Henry V of England. That means her blood, and her father's madness, entered the English royal bloodline. Their son was Henry VI, the same fragile boy king who grew up to rule while catatonic. The seeds of royal madness were now firmly planted in English soil. 7. Queen Anne, the grief-addled queen. If madness can be born from grief, then Queen Anne stands near the top of the list. She reigned during a time of political transformation, but she herself was a tragic figure. Anne suffered from gout, obesity, and severe depression, but that's not what drove her over the edge. It was her children, or rather, her lack of them. Anne was pregnant 17 times, 17. Only one child lived past infancy, Prince William, and he died at age 11. Each pregnancy ended in miscarriage, stillbirth, or early death. By the end of her reign, she was surrounded by empty nurseries, tiny coffins, and dolls that no longer had names. She became paranoid, emotionally volatile, and dependent on her female confidants, especially Sarah Churchill. Their falling out turned into a palace war. Anne believed Sarah was poisoning her, stealing her letters, conspiring with her enemies. She isolated herself in her chambers, speaking to portraits of her dead children, and refusing to change out of mourning clothes. It wasn't the theatrical insanity of a mad king. It was the slow, crushing madness of a grieving mother who wore a crown heavier than any grief could bear. 6. Henry VIII, the paranoid executioner. Now we come to the most infamous monarch in British history. Was Henry VIII mad? Let's weigh the evidence. At the start, he was handsome, athletic, charismatic. But over time, something changed. He suffered a traumatic jousting injury, possibly a skull fracture, that altered his behavior forever. His temper became volcanic, his decisions erratic. He became convinced that everyone, every advisor, every wife was plotting against him. He executed 2 of his 6 wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, both beheaded for treason. Anne was charged with adultery, incest, and witchcraft. Historians today agree the charges were almost certainly fabricated, but Henry believed them. He looked into Anne's eyes the night before her death and saw betrayal. More than 57,000 executions were carried out during his reign. He trusted no one. His closest friend, Thomas More, beheaded. His longtime minister, Thomas Cromwell, also beheaded. He even changed his mind about Cromwell after the execution, saying it had been a mistake. In the final years, Henry's legs were ulcerated and rotting. He was obese and barely mobile, but he still ruled with iron paranoia, signing death warrants from bed, convinced that ghosts of his wives whispered behind palace walls. Not screaming madness, cold, calculating, bloody madness. 5. Mary, Queen of Scots, the beautiful storm. She was elegant, educated, and charming, but Mary, Queen of Scots, ruled through a hurricane of scandal, obsession, and ultimately, collapse. She became Queen of Scotland at just 6 days old, crowned Queen of France as a teenager, and then, everything unraveled. Her second husband, Lord Darnley, was a drunk and abusive. Then suddenly he was found murdered, strangled and blown up. And Mary? She married the man suspected of the murder just weeks later, James Bothwell. Scandal exploded across Europe. Nobles rose in revolt. Mary was imprisoned, escaped, fled to England, and was promptly locked up by her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. Now, the madness began to bloom. While imprisoned, Mary believed she was chosen by God to rule both Scotland and England. She wrote cryptic letters, plotted against Elizabeth, and became fixated on the idea that martyrdom was her destiny. When she was finally sentenced to death, Mary dressed in crimson, the Catholic color of martyrdom, and mounted the scaffold with a prayer on her lips. When the axe struck, it didn't sever cleanly. The executioner struck again, and again. On the 3rd blow, her head finally fell, but her wig slipped off, and her real gray hair revealed. The illusion died with her. Was Mary mad? Or was the world simply too mad for a woman like her? Number 4. King John, the laughing tyrant. Forget what Disney told you. King John was not just a cowardly lion. He was a deeply disturbed monarch, paranoid, cruel, possibly sadistic. He once starved 22 knights to death, locked in dungeons with their families. He executed Arthur of Brittany, his teenage nephew, by reportedly drowning him in wine. He had a habit of laughing hysterically during executions, especially when political enemies suffered. But that wasn't the worst. He believed everyone, including his barons, were conspiring against him. He kept secret spies, tortured messengers, and had a habit of disappearing from court in the middle of the night. When confronted by the Pope, he excommunicated himself from the church, then panicked, crawling on his knees to beg forgiveness. In his final days, John gorged himself on peaches and cider while England burned in civil war. He died vomiting blood, betrayed, abandoned, and insane. The Magna Carta may have come from his reign, but it was a desperate leash tied to a frothing, barking monarch. Arch 3. Queen Victoria, the Haunted Widow. The image of Queen Victoria is cold and dignified. Black dresses, a stern expression, and endless portraits of moral virtue. But inside, Victoria was collapsing. When Prince Albert died in 1861, she stopped functioning. She wore black for the rest of her life. She slept beside his clothes. She kept his shaving basin ready every morning, as if he might return. For 40 years, she mourned as though it had just happened yesterday. She spoke to his ghost. She demanded silence in his rooms, and she became increasingly reliant on servants, especially one Scottish gillie named John Brown, whom she may have believed was possessed by Albert's spirit. By the end, Victoria was physically frail and emotionally shattered. She withdrew from court, from her family, from the world. Politicians begged her to appear in public, but she remained in her fortress of mourning, whispering to shadows, clutching a lock of Albert's hair like a relic. Madness or infinite grief? Maybe both. 2. Charles I, the Martyr King. Charles I didn't just go mad, he made his entire nation go mad with him. He believed, truly believed, that kings were chosen by God, above all law, beyond all criticism. When Parliament resisted, Charles dissolved it. Then he dissolved it again. Then he ruled alone for 11 years, a tyrant in velvet gloves. He taxed unlawfully, imprisoned critics without trial, and imposed a religious uniformity that alienated nearly every corner of his realm. When civil war finally erupted, Charles refused to compromise. Even after defeat, even after arrest, he still believed himself untouchable. At his trial, Charles refused to recognize the court's legitimacy. He stood silently as witnesses testified. When asked for a defense, he said, "A subject may not judge his sovereign." He was found guilty of treason. On the scaffold, he wore 2 shirts so he wouldn't shiver in the cold and appear afraid. As the axe fell, a groan rose from the crowd, not in anger, but in disbelief. A king had gone to his death, not with madness of mind, but with the madness of unbreakable ego. A king who believed he was sacred, right up until the moment his head rolled into a basket. We've already passed through the corridors of grief, paranoia, and divine delusion, but now the walls start to bleed. Now we meet monarchs who didn't just break, they shattered, into whispers, into ghosts, into monsters of their own making. These weren't rulers who wore crowns. These were rulers who wore madness like a second skin. LeChuck 1, King George III, the Mad King himself. Let's not delay it. When people talk about madness in British royalty, one name always rises first, George III. But here's the truth most people don't know. George wasn't mad, at first. In fact, he was kind, gentle, intellectual. He read philosophy, he loved farming. He was devoted to his wife, Queen Charlotte, and tried to rule with balance. But somewhere in middle age, something cracked. His first breakdown came in 1788. He began talking for hours, non-stop, until his voice went hoarse. He made strange gestures. He spoke to people who weren't there. He believed he could talk to angels. And most disturbingly, he tried to shake hands with trees, thinking they were the kings of Prussia. Doctors bled him, tied him to chairs, locked him in rooms for days. But the episodes returned, more violent, more vivid. He screamed that he was already dead. He sobbed uncontrollably while playing the harpsichord. Once, he spoke for 58 hours straight, describing visions of God, the devil, and the end of time. The court tried to keep it secret, but the rot was spreading. By the early 1800s, George was nearly blind, deaf, and completely detached from reality. He was replaced by his son, the Prince Regent, and lived the rest of his days wandering Windsor Castle, speaking to the ghosts of his daughters, and mistaking moonlight for heaven. Today, historians believe he suffered from porphyria, a rare metabolic disorder that causes hallucinations and mental decline. Others say bipolar disorder or arsenic poisoning, but to the world he will always be the Mad King. And yet, he ruled for 59 years, longer than any king before him. The irony? He lost America, but kept the throne. The uncrowned madness, Princess Alexandra of Bavaria, not a queen, not even crowned, but her story belongs here. Alexandra was a princess of the Bavarian royal house, connected by blood to several British royals. and she suffered from a delusion so bizarre it sounds like a children's fairy tale gone wrong. She believed, genuinely, that she had swallowed a grand piano. Not a tiny one, a full-size glass grand piano. She tiptoed through the palace, afraid that sudden movement might shatter her from the inside. She wore only white, spoke in whispers, refused to sit down quickly or turn corners sharply. Her attendants described her as ethereal, like a dream trapped in silk. Some called it glass delusion, a rare medieval condition where nobles believed they were made of fragile materials. Others said it was schizophrenia, but Alexandra lived a long life, protected by her family, her rituals, and the fantasy she carried inside her like a phantom melody. She died believing the piano was still there. The Forgotten Madness, Queen Joanna of Castile, aka Joanna the Mad. Yes, she's Spanish. But Joanna's blood ran straight into the British line, through her grandson, Philip II of Spain, and her granddaughter Mary I of England. And madness? Madness ruled her life. Joanna was smart, fierce, politically gifted, but when her husband, Philip the Handsome, died suddenly, she snapped. She refused to bury him. She slept beside his corpse for months. She had his coffin carried across the countryside, ordering the lid opened at night so she could kiss his face. When the stench became unbearable, she simply stuffed herbs into his clothes and continued the journey. She believed he wasn't dead, just sleeping, or worse, that others were trying to steal his soul. She banned all other women from coming near the coffin, terrified that Philip might be unfaithful even in death. Eventually, her father locked her away. Her son, Charles V, kept her imprisoned for 46 years. By the end, Joanna was completely silent, sitting in darkness, clutching a black veil, refusing to eat unless her dead husband approved. And yet, technically, she was Queen of Castile that entire time. Her madness traveled through bloodlines, and some whisper it left a scar in English history, too. George IV, the party king who lost his mind in the mirror. His father, George III, went mad in isolation. George IV? He went mad in decadence. He built palaces, hosted endless feasts. He wore jewels worth more than entire villages. But his personal life? A complete collapse. He married Caroline of Brunswick, a woman he hated from the moment he saw her. He spent the wedding night drunk, weeping and vomiting in a fireplace. Their marriage collapsed in weeks. George became addicted to laudanum, a mix of alcohol and opium, morphine and food. His waistline ballooned. He spent his days drunk, drugged, and hallucinating, sometimes screaming at his reflection, accusing it of betrayal. He believed his enemies were hiding in mirrors. He covered some in sheets, smashed others. Servants once found him arguing with a portrait, believing it had insulted him. Toward the end, he rarely left bed. His urine turned purple from the opium. He demanded raw meat and wine for breakfast. He wrote love letters to himself. And still, somehow, he was crowned king. Mad? Absolutely. But it was the madness of decay, not drama. Edward II, tortured by power, and possibly by his own court. Edward II is remembered for failure, but his descent into madness was slower, more tragic. He was not like his father, Edward I, no warrior, no strategist. He surrounded himself with favorites, Gaveston, Despenser, young men who were rumored to be lovers. Nobles despised them. Rebellions exploded. Edward began trusting only them. He built a world of paranoia and retreat, cutting off advisors, ignoring crises. He believed his barons were demons in disguise. He once told his court he could hear whispers from the devil in the wind. No one laughed. When his wife, Isabella, invaded England with her lover Mortimer, Edward was captured and imprisoned in Berkeley Castle. There, things turned dark. Rumors claim he was murdered by having a red-hot poker inserted into his body, a symbolic punishment for his alleged homosexuality. Others say he was kept alive for years, half-starved and babbling in the dungeon, believing he was still king. Whatever the truth, Edward's madness was born not of grandeur, but of betrayal, fear, and humiliation. Mary Vambre, the queen of fire and shadows, Mary Tudor. Bloody Mary! Her name still echoes in mirrors and childhood games, but behind the legend is a woman tormented by religious guilt, phantom pregnancies, and dreams of fire. Mary believed her mission was divine, to return England to Catholicism. But after marrying Philip of Spain, her cousin, she became obsessed with bearing an heir. Her belly swelled, her breasts leaked, but no child came. It was a phantom pregnancy, then another, and then another. Some believe it was a psychological disorder. Others suggest a tumor. Mary fell into despair. She believed God was punishing her. She fasted. She beat herself with rosaries. She screamed at portraits of Protestant martyrs. And then she began the burnings. Nearly 300 Protestants were executed under her rule. She believed every flame brought her closer to salvation. But the people turned. They whispered. They feared. And Mary, isolated in her palace, began to hear the screams even when no one burned. She died childless, unmourned. Her crown passed to Elizabeth, but her madness still lingers in the shadow of every cathedral that survived the fire. Henry VI, the king who forgot he was alive. Henry VI is perhaps the purest case of royal madness in British history. He was gentle, bookish, deeply religious. He didn't hunt, he didn't feast, he hated violence. In another life, he might have been a monk, but he was crowned King of England in France before his first birthday. The Wars of the Roses tore his mind apart. He ruled during chaos, betrayals, battles. He lost Normandy. He lost his court. He lost his sanity. In 1453, after hearing of a massive English defeat, Henry collapsed into a catatonic state that lasted 17 months. He spoke to no one, reacted to nothing. He didn't recognize his own newborn son. His eyes were open, but no one was home. When he awoke, his mind was shattered. He spoke in riddles. He forgot where he was. He talked to birds. He once ordered his court to pray for the soul of a spoon he believed had committed a sin. He was overthrown, imprisoned, and, some say, murdered in the Tower of London, weeping and murmuring psalms. We've passed whispers in the throne room, wandered through ghostly coronations, and watched kings talk to angels and queens beg God for burning flesh. But now, we rank them. Now we decide who wore madness most royally. 10. Mary Y, Bloody Mary, tortured by guilt, haunted by God, and ruled by phantom pregnancies. Mary turned her kingdom into a funeral pyre, convinced every flame purified her soul. Her madness wasn't chaos. It was structured, methodical, religious. That's what made it so terrifying. She believed she was saving England by burning it. 9. Edward II delusional, paranoid, manipulated by young favorites. His reign descended into violent betrayal, and his end is cloaked in mythic horror. His was a slow, sad unraveling, not the loud madness of screaming prophets, but the quiet kind that whispers behind castle walls until it's too late to stop it. 8. George IV. This was madness born from vanity and narcotics. George IV saw the demons in mirrors, talked to portraits, and drowned himself in laudanum, believing his reflection was plotting a coup. He didn't lose touch with reality. He erased it and replaced it with silk, wine, and delusion. 7. Princess Alexandra of Bavaria, not crowned, but unforgettable. The woman who thought she had a glass piano inside her body walked through life with ghost-like delicacy. Her delusion was surreal, poetic, and tragically completely real to her. She belongs on this list because her fantasy lasted longer than some monarchs' reigns. 6. Queen Joanna of Castile dragged her husband's rotting corpse through the countryside, kissed it at night, and whispered secrets to his coffin for months. Her madness was grief in its purest, most grotesque form. They locked her away for life, but in her mind, she was never alone. 5. Henry VI. He forgot who he was, forgot who anyone was. For 17 months, the King of England was a breathing statue. He came back speaking riddles and praying for spoons. Henry wasn't mad and burst, he was absent. And when he returned, his mind was ash. Number 4. George III, the Mad King, the icon, the legend, the monarch who screamed at trees and talked to the sun. His madness came in waves, sometimes calm, sometimes feral. And through it all, he remained on the throne, his mind drifting between clarity and chaos. The fact that he ruled for 6 decades makes it even more unsettling. But the top 3, they're different. They weren't just broken, they were cursed. 3. Charles VI of France. Honorable mad guest appearance. Yes, he wasn't a British king, but his madness invaded the British royal bloodstream through marriage, alliances, and war. And Charles VI? He thought he was made of glass. He ordered iron rods sewn into his clothes so he wouldn't shatter. He attacked his own servants, believing they were assassins. He once murdered 4 of his knights in a blind frenzy, and then fell into a trance for 9 hours. Entire months passed where he couldn't remember his own name, or that he was king. But here's why he matters. His daughter married Henry V of England, and that bloodline? It carried echoes of glass and fire. 2. King James VI and first the Witch King, the demon hunter, the man who saw Satan behind every tree. James wasn't just paranoid, he was obsessed. After surviving a storm at sea, he became convinced witches were trying to kill him. He launched the most vicious witch hunts in British history, torturing hundreds and burning dozens. He wrote a book, Demonology, which became a how-to manual for witch torture. He believed the devil had infiltrated his court. He thought demons traveled through ink and dreams. He slept with a dagger under his pillow and salt around his bed, and he whispered prayers to invisible angels, often while sitting on the privy. James also believed he had divine vision, that he could see lies by watching a man's pupils dilate. He would interrogate his own ministers in candlelight, staring into their eyes until they confessed things they hadn't done. He distrusted women, feared Catholics, and believed thunder was a divine warning. And yet, he ruled both England and Scotland, united the crowns, and helped authorize the King James Bible. He was brilliant and haunted, a man who thought he sat on 2 thrones, one earthly, one apocalyptic, the Lord one, King Henry VIII. The maddest monarch wasn't the most violent, or the loudest, or even the most visibly insane. It was the one whose madness was perfectly rational to himself. Henry VIII believed he was chosen by God, that his desires were sacred law, that when he looked into a mirror, he saw not a man, but God's hand on earth. And that's what made him monstrous. He began as a golden boy, charismatic, athletic, educated, but power warped him like heat warps iron. His mind twisted slowly. He became obsessed with his legacy, with male heirs, with betrayal. He developed paranoid delusions, convinced his wives were conspiring against him. He heard confessions no one gave, dreamed of plots, trusted no one. So he executed Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, countless advisors, even close friends. He ordered deaths like someone else might rearrange furniture, coldly, strategically, as if destiny demanded it. He was convinced his leg wound was a punishment from God. He rubbed holy oil into it. He believed his ulcers whispered to him at night. Servants reported him shouting at shadows in his chamber, blaming traitors in the blood. Toward the end, he ballooned in size. His legs stank of rot. His eyes turned glassy. He would sit for hours, muttering Latin phrases and gripping a dagger. He often asked if the room had seen Jane, his dead wife, the only one he claimed to love. Some historians say he had Cushing's syndrome, others say syphilis. But the most chilling theory? Psychotic megalomania. Henry didn't think he was mad. He thought he was England, the crown's curse. Here's the terrifying part. The British monarchy, from the Plantagenets to the Tudors to the Windsors, has always flirted with madness. It hides behind etiquette. It wears ermine and jewels. But it's there. A curse in the blood, an echo in the crown. It's in the way Elizabeth I spoke to mirrors, in the way Queen Victoria mourned for 40 years, in the way Prince John was hidden from public view for his seizures and fits. Even in the stoic silence of modern monarchs, something pulses beneath. Because power, absolute power, warps the mind, and sometimes the most dangerous rulers aren't the ones who scream. They're the ones who smile and believe every word of the lie. Hey guys, what if I told you the throne of England once passed from warrior kings drenched in blood to a man who talked to his plants? From warlords and saints to tyrants and visionaries, the British crown has never been just a symbol. It's been a lightning rod for madness, ambition, tragedy, and glory. So buckle up. We're about to embark on the most dramatic royal timeline in history. It begins in fire and sword, not in palaces, but on the blood-stained soil of early medieval England. Before the polished portraits and powdered wigs, before royal proclamations and televised coronations, there was Alfred, not yet the great, not yet legend, just Alfred, a young prince of Wessex facing annihilation. In the year 871, Alfred becomes king at the worst possible moment. Viking warbands, ferocious, relentless, godless, are carving up the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms like meat. Most rulers crumble or flee, not Alfred. He vanishes into the marshes, hiding in the swamps of Somerset. He becomes a ghost king, rallying what remains of his people from the shadows. When he returns, he doesn't just push the Vikings back. He rewrites the blueprint of kingship. Alfred doesn't conquer, he builds. Schools, laws, defenses. He insists the king should be literate. He dreams of a united English people bound by law and faith. He dies in 899, not as a warlord, but as a philosopher king, the father of England. His descendants will try to finish what he started. One of them, Aethelstan, arguably succeeds. In 927, he unites the fractured English kingdoms under one crown. For the first time, England is not just an idea, it's real. But unity is fragile, and ambition is dangerous. Fast forward to the 11th century. Edward the Confessor, deeply pious and eerily passive, rules a kingdom held together by threads. When he dies childless in 1066, it triggers one of the most brutal succession crises in European history. 3 men claim the throne: Harold Godwinson, Harold Hardrada of Norway, and William of Normandy. Harold defeats the Norwegians at Stamford Bridge, but he doesn't get to enjoy his victory. William crosses the channel with his Norman knights, claiming the crown was promised to him. The 2 armies clash at Hastings. Harold is killed, perhaps with an arrow through the eye, perhaps hacked to pieces. The Normans win, and with them comes a new order. William the Conqueror transforms England. Norman French becomes the language of the elite. Castles rise like stone fists across the land. Power becomes centralized, brutal, efficient. In 1086, William orders the Domesday Book, an inventory of every cow, acre, and pig in the land. It's not just data, it's control. William's sons, Robert, William Rufus, and Henry I, fight bitterly over his legacy. William Rufus dies under mysterious circumstances, shot with an arrow while hunting in the New Forest. Accident? Assassination? We'll never know. Henry I seizes the crown, but fate has other plans. His only legitimate son drowns in the White Ship disaster in 1120. With his heir gone, the kingdom teeters on chaos. Henry names his daughter Matilda as successor, but England is not ready for a ruling queen. When he dies, her cousin Stephen seizes the throne, plunging the kingdom into a civil war known as the Anarchy. For nearly 2 decades, England burns. Towns are pillaged. Nobles switch sides like dancers at a masquerade. Eventually, a compromise is reached. Stephen can rule, but after him, Matilda's son, Henry, will become king. And so he does. In 1154, Henry II becomes the first of the Plantagenets, one of the most powerful and volatile dynasties in English history. Henry is a genius and a tyrant. He transforms law and administration, but can't control his own family. His wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, once the most powerful woman in Europe, turns against him. His sons rebel. One of them, Richard the Lionheart, becomes a legend, more myth than man. Richard barely sets foot in England. He spends his reign on crusade, fighting Saladin in the Holy Land, captured in Austria, and ransomed at outrageous cost. He dies from a crossbow wound in 1199. His brother John takes the throne, and immediately becomes one of the most hated monarchs in English history. John loses almost all of England's French territories. He feuds with the church, starves his enemies to death, and taxes his nobles into open revolt. In 1215, the barons force him to sign the Magna Carta, a document that begins the long road toward constitutional monarchy. But John ignores it. Civil war erupts. John dies in 1216, supposedly from dysentery, howling and alone. His 9-year-old son, Henry III, inherits a fractured kingdom. His reign is long, 56 years, but troubled. The barons rise again, led by Simon de Montfort. Parliament is born not from peace but rebellion. Though Henry survives, the balance of power between monarch and nobility begins to shift. Then comes Edward I, Longshanks, the hammer of the Scots. Towering and ruthless, he subdues Wales and wages brutal war against Scotland. He expels the Jews from England. He builds castles and codifies law. His legacy is iron-fisted order. His son, Edward II, is his opposite, weak, indecisive, dominated by favorites. His reign is marked by humiliation, especially at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where the Scots under Robert the Bruce shatter the English army. Eventually, Edward is deposed by his own wife Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer. He is imprisoned, then murdered, possibly with a red-hot poker. The crown passes to his teenage son, Edward III. Edward III restores royal prestige through sheer force of personality. He launches the 100 Years' War against France, claiming its throne. His reign is a strange paradox: glory abroad, devastation at home. The Black Death hits England in 1348, killing nearly half the population. Labor collapses, society fractures, but Edward soldiers on. His son, the brilliant Black Prince, dies before him. The throne passes to the Black Prince's son, Richard II, a boy of 10. Richard's reign is marked by turmoil. The peasants' revolt erupts in 1381. His rule becomes increasingly autocratic and erratic. Eventually, he is deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who becomes Henry IV. It's a coup, and it sets a dangerous precedent. Kings can now be overthrown. Henry IV rules uneasily. His health fails. His reign is one of survival. His son, Henry V, is very different. Charismatic, ruthless, militaristic. He wins a miraculous victory at Agincourt in 1415, cementing his legend. But he dies young in 1422, leaving an infant son, Henry VI, as king. And now the story turns tragic. Henry VI is gentle, pious, and mentally unstable. He suffers from catatonic episodes. His rule crumbles. The nobles tear each other apart in the Wars of the Roses. Two rival branches of the Plantagenet family, the Lancasters and the Yorks, fight for the throne in a generation-long bloodbath. The Wars of the Roses were not just battles. They were executions in slow motion. Brothers turned on brothers, kings were crowned and then hunted like criminals, and blood was spilled so frequently that England's royal lineage became soaked in paranoia. At the center of this maelstrom stood Henry VI, a man more suited for a monastery than a monarchy. Prayers spilled from his lips when commands should have. For months at a time, he would sit unresponsive, unable to speak, unable even to recognize his own son. Into this void stepped ambitious nobles who didn't want to rule with him. They wanted to rule instead of him. Enter Edward of York. Tall, handsome, militarily brilliant, everything Henry VI was not. After a series of bloody battles, Edward seized the throne in 1461, declaring himself Edward IV. But England had developed a taste for instability, and the throne became a throne of daggers. Henry VI was briefly restored, then deposed again. He died mysteriously, likely murdered, while imprisoned in the Tower of London. His only son, Edward of Westminster, died in battle. The Lancastrian line was snuffed out. Edward IV reigned with strength, but his death in 1483 reopened the gates of chaos. His young sons, Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury, were placed in the Tower of London for safekeeping, but safekeeping turned into silence. The princes vanished. Their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seized the throne and became Richard III. To this day, no one knows for certain what happened to the princes in the tower. Some say Richard had them smothered in their sleep. Others blame later usurpers. But what matters is this: their disappearance gave Richard a cursed crown. He ruled for just 2 years, his legitimacy questioned, his kingdom brittle. Then came Henry Tudor. At the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, Richard III charged into the fray wearing his crown. He fought savagely, but it was the end. A horse, my kingdom for a horse. Shakespeare would later write, but no horse came. Richard was cut down, his crown retrieved from the mud and placed on Henry Tudor's head. The Plantagenet dynasty, after over 300 years, was dead. Henry VII founded a new line, the Tudors, but his claim was shaky. His reign was a masterclass in paranoia. He married Elizabeth of York to unite the warring houses. He crushed rivals, hoarded wealth, and built a monarchy that was as calculating as it was fragile. Then came Henry VIII, the Renaissance prince turned tyrant. Early in his reign, he was athletic, charming, and pious. But underneath the pageantry simmered obsessions, chief among them producing a male heir. When his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, failed to deliver one, Henry sought a solution no English king had dared before. He broke from the Roman Catholic Church. He married Anne Boleyn and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. This wasn't just a divorce, it was a religious earthquake. Monasteries were dissolved, priests were executed, England was severed from centuries of tradition. Anne gave him a daughter, Elizabeth, but no son. She was soon accused of adultery, incest, and treason. She was executed. Her head fell, but Henry's thirst was not quenched. 6 wives in total, 2 beheaded, 1 died, 2 divorced, 1 outlived him. His longed-for son, Edward VI, came at last, but at a terrible cost. Henry had left the church in tatters, and the monarchy bloated with fear. Edward VI, just a boy when he took the throne, ruled through Protestant regents. He died young in 1553. A struggle for succession followed, with Lady Jane Grey, Edward's Protestant cousin, placed on the throne for just 9 days before being overthrown. In marched Mary I, daughter of Catherine of Aragon. A devout Catholic, she sought to undo the Protestant reforms. Her reign was marked by flames. Over 280 Protestants were burned at the stake. History remembers her as Bloody Mary. But it was Elizabeth I, daughter of Anne Boleyn, who became one of England's greatest monarchs. She inherited a bankrupt, divided realm, but she ruled with razor-sharp intelligence, unmatched political instincts, and a flair for drama. Elizabeth never married, branding herself the Virgin Queen. Under her rule, England flourished. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 cemented her legend, but her court was a web of intrigue. Her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, plotted, or was accused of plotting, against her. Elizabeth had her executed. Elizabeth's death in 1603 ended the Tudor dynasty. She had no children, no heir, and so the throne passed to the Stuarts, starting with James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. A new dynasty, a new world. James was learned, theatrical, and obsessed with witches. He commissioned the King James Bible, a literary masterpiece, but struggled to rule a kingdom suspicious of his Scottish roots. Parliament resented his spending. The seeds of conflict were planted. His son, Charles I, inherited more than the crown. He inherited a storm. Charles believed in divine right, the idea that kings answered only to God. But Parliament had other ideas. He dissolved them, then called them back, then dissolved them again. Tensions exploded into the English Civil War. On one side, Charles and the Royalists. On the other, Parliament led by Oliver Cromwell. Years of brutal fighting followed. Charles lost. He was captured, tried, and in 1649, executed, a king beheaded, a monarchy abolished. England became a republic. Cromwell ruled as Lord Protector, but he was no less autocratic. When he died, chaos returned. The people had had enough of Puritanism, enough of rule without a crown. In 1660, they restored the monarchy. Enter Charles II. Charles was everything Cromwell was not. He brought back theater, music, and wine. His court was decadent, his mistresses legendary, but he played politics skillfully, balancing parliament and power. He ruled during the Great Plague, the Great Fire of London, and constant whispers of Catholic conspiracy. When he died, his brother, James II, took the throne. But James was openly Catholic, and England was not having it. In 1688, the Glorious Revolution swept him aside. Parliament invited William of Orange and his wife Mary, James's Protestant daughter, to take the throne. No war, no bloodshed, just a quiet revolution that would define the modern British monarchy. The age of absolute monarchy was over. Parliament now held the reins. William and Mary ruled jointly. Mary died childless. William ruled alone until his death in 1702. Then came Mary's sister, Queen Anne. Anne's reign saw the unification of England and Scotland into Great Britain in 1707, but her personal life was tragic. She had 17 pregnancies. None of her children survived to adulthood. When she died in 1714, the throne passed to a distant cousin from Germany. The death of Queen Anne in 1714 marked not just the end of a queen, but the end of an English-born dynasty. With no surviving heirs, the crown passed to a distant Protestant relative, George I, Elector of Hanover. He didn't speak English, he barely knew England, but he had the right religion, and that was enough. Thus began the Hanoverian dynasty, an era of kings who ruled over a country they didn't quite understand. George I was awkward, cold, and deeply unpopular. He spent most of his reign in Germany, leaving his ministers to govern. It was during his time that a new political office quietly began to rise: the Prime Minister. Parliament was no longer just a check on the crown. It was becoming the true seat of power. George II wasn't much better. He clashed with his son, scowled at the English weather, and fought wars in Europe. But under his reign, the monarchy slowly evolved into the symbolic institution we recognize today. The crown remained, but the power shifted to Parliament. And then came George III. If you know one Hanoverian king, it's him, the man who lost America. But there's more to his story than redcoats and revolution. George III was dutiful, moral, and serious. He wanted to be a king who served his people. But the world was changing. Enlightenment ideas spread like wildfire. Colonists in America demanded representation. George refused. The result, the American Revolution. In 1776, 13 colonies declared independence. 7 years of war followed. Britain lost. George's empire shrank. But at home, he remained popular. Then came something darker. In the 1780s, George began to experience violent bouts of mental illness. He would babble for hours, foam at the mouth, and talk to trees. Doctors were baffled. Treatments were barbaric. Leeches, restraints, isolation. It's now believed he suffered from porphyria, a rare genetic disorder. But at the time, they simply said the king had gone mad. His condition worsened in the early 1800s. By 1811, he was declared unfit to rule. His son took over as Prince Regent, ruling in his place. George III lingered for nearly a decade, blind, deaf, and delusional, before dying in 1820. Then came George IV, the Regency prince turned monarch. And oh, what a contrast he was. Where his father was moral and dutiful, George IV was extravagant, flamboyant, and deeply in debt. He built the opulent royal pavilion in Brighton, indulged in scandalous affairs, and alienated Parliament with his indulgence. His coronation was a grotesque display of excess. Even his wife was barred from attending. But despite the drama, his reign marked a time of cultural brilliance. Britain was becoming the center of a global empire. Art, literature, and architecture flourished, even as the monarchy's moral authority crumbled. After him came William IV, known as the Sailor King. Less dramatic, more pragmatic. He supported reforms, including the Great Reform Act of 1832, which began the long process of expanding the vote to ordinary men. But he died without surviving legitimate children, and that brought forth the dawn of a new age, an age of iron, empire, and a queen who would outlive them all. Victoria. She was just 18 when she ascended the throne in 1837. Small, shy, and untested. But within years, she became an icon, a symbol of a global empire on which the sun never set. Victoria reigned for 63 years, overseeing industrial revolutions, colonial expansion, and a Britain transformed by railways, factories, and telegraphs. But behind the image of imperial grandeur was a woman profoundly shaped by love and loss. She married her cousin, Prince Albert, and their marriage was unusually close for a royal union. They had 9 children and ruled as partners, he in private, she in public. When Albert died in 1861, Victoria was shattered. She wore black for the rest of her life and withdrew from public duties for years, prompting calls to abolish the monarchy altogether. But she returned, and with a vengeance. In 1876, she was proclaimed Empress of India, a title that embodied Britain's global dominance. Her later reign was filled with jubilees, monuments, and the cultivation of an image: Victoria the matriarch, Victoria the unifier of an empire. When she died in 1901, the Victorian era ended, but the 20th century had only just begun. Her son, Edward VII, ushered in the Edwardian era, a time of elegance, decadence, and looming doom. Edward was a playboy prince, known for his love affairs and lavish lifestyle. But as king, he proved capable, navigating international tensions with tact. Still, the world he ruled was teetering. Nationalism was rising, alliances were forming. And then, in 1910, Edward died. His son, George V, took the throne. 4 years later, World War I exploded. George V faced a crisis like no monarch before. Cousins fought cousins. George was a first cousin of both Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. The war devastated Europe and shattered empires. To distance the monarchy from its German roots, George changed the royal house's name from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to something more English, the House of Windsor. It was a PR move, but a masterstroke. The monarchy survived. George V reigned through the war into the Roaring Twenties. He faced strikes, social unrest, and a rising Republican movement, but through it all, he remained a steady hand, a symbol of continuity in a world spinning apart. He died in 1936. What followed was one of the most shocking abdications in royal history. His eldest son became Edward VIII, but not for long. Edward was charismatic, fashionable, and completely uninterested in the constraints of royal duty. He fell in love with Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. The government, the church, and the public were scandalized. Faced with a choice between the crown and the woman he loved, Edward chose love. He abdicated after less than a year, making way for his shy, stammering younger brother, George VI. George VI never wanted to be king, but in the darkest hour of the 20th century, he became one of its most beloved monarchs. When World War II broke out in 1939, he refused to leave London during the Blitz. He walked among bombed-out neighborhoods. He spoke to the nation with dignity and resolve. Alongside Winston Churchill, George VI became a figure of defiance against Nazi terror. He helped keep Britain's spirit alive, even as cities burned. When the war ended, the British Empire began to fade. India gained independence in 1947. The sun began to set on empire. George VI died in 1952, and with his death came the dawn of a new age, the Elizabethan Age II. Her coronation would be seen by millions on television. Her reign would be the longest in British history. When Elizabeth II was crowned in 1953, she was just 27 years old, grieving the sudden death of her father, thrust into a role shaped by centuries of tradition and expectation. Britain was still licking its wounds from the Second World War. Rationing hadn't even ended. The empire was crumbling. The world she inherited was tired, uncertain, and desperate for renewal. But Elizabeth didn't flinch. She became not just a monarch, but a symbol of continuity, of dignity, of quiet strength. Through the Cold War, the swinging 60s, the oil crises, Thatcherism, and the dawn of the internet, she endured. 12 prime ministers would serve under her, beginning with Winston Churchill himself. She met with them weekly, her face always unreadable, her words measured. She was the sovereign above the storms, present in crisis, silent in scandal. And there were many scandals. Her sister, Princess Margaret, loved a divorced man and was forbidden to marry him. Her daughter-in-law, Princess Diana, married Prince Charles in a wedding watched by 750 million people, only for the fairy tale to curdle into betrayal, affairs, and a tabloid-feeding frenzy. In 1992, what the Queen herself called her annus horribilis, Windsor Castle caught fire, Prince Andrew divorced, Princess Anne divorced, and Charles and Diana's marriage imploded. The monarchy began to look archaic, distant, no longer untouchable. Then came 1997. Princess Diana died in a car crash in Paris. The nation mourned. Flowers piled outside Buckingham Palace like waves, but the Queen remained silent. The people wanted grief. They wanted feeling. Instead, they got protocol. It was perhaps the most dangerous moment for the monarchy since the abdication. But Elizabeth adjusted. She appeared on television. She spoke to the nation, not as a queen, but as a grandmother. The tide turned. The monarchy, just barely, survived. In the decades that followed, she modernized in her own quiet way. She allowed cameras into her palace. She smiled more, laughed more, showed glimpses of humanity. She became not just a monarch, but a national grandmother, a relic of a vanishing world, but a deeply loved one. She became the longest reigning monarch in British history. She saw the fall of the Soviet Union, the rise of social media, Brexit, COVID, and the death of her beloved husband, Prince Philip, in 2021. And then, in September 2022, At the age of 96, Elizabeth II died. Her passing marked the end of an era, perhaps the era. The Second Elizabethan age was over, and in her place the throne passed to a man who had waited longer than any heir in history. Charles III. His path to the crown had been long, rocky, and controversial. His first marriage, torn apart by infidelity. His second, long denied by tradition. For decades he was a figure of ridicule. But by the time he ascended, the world had changed. Charles III represents a different kind of monarch. He has spoken out on climate change, architecture, and the role of modern society. He is less mysterious than his mother, more opinionated, more visible, more vulnerable. The question now is simple and seismic. Can the monarchy survive him? In a world of TikToks and Twitter, of collapsing institutions and generational divides, is there still a place for a man in a crown? Because behind the jewels, behind the robes, behind the centuries of ceremony, is a human being. The British monarchy, for all its power and privilege, is built on one fragile thing: public trust. Lose that, and everything crumbles. And as King Charles begins his reign, the monarchy stands on a precipice. Younger generations are turning away. Republican sentiment is growing. Scandals, such as those involving Prince Andrew and internal royal rifts, are no longer whispers, they're viral videos. Even the Queen's death, mourned globally, exposed the crown's new vulnerability. In centuries past, monarchs ruled by divine right. Today, they rule by consent, and consent in the age of algorithms can vanish overnight. Charles has pledged a slimmed-down monarchy, a leaner, more modern institution. But can you modernize a system built on feudal foundations? And what of his heir, Prince William? He represents the future, the hope, the bridge to a younger public. His image is carefully curated, the dutiful son, the loving father, the stabilizing force. But even he is not immune to the pressures of the modern age. Every gesture, every glance, every misstep is dissected, debated, devoured. Then there's Harry, the spare turned renegade. His exit from royal life, his explosive interviews, his memoir, these have reshaped the royal narrative. For the first time, the public saw inside the machine, and many didn't like what they saw. But that's the paradox of the modern monarchy. To survive, it must be seen, but the more it's seen, the more fragile it becomes. From Alfred the Great, fighting Viking invasions with sword in hand, to Charles III, navigating a media-saturated world where a single tweet can start a firestorm. This is the arc of kingship, of queenship, of human ambition, frailty, and endurance. 1,200 years of crowns and crises, of beheadings and jubilees, of civil wars and royal weddings, and still it endures, not because it is perfect, but because it is storied, because it reminds us, however dimly, of something ancient, something sacred, something larger than ourselves. So, as the crown rests now upon the head of a man nearing 80, after all the bloodshed, betrayal, glory, and grief, we are left with a question. Not who will be the next monarch, but whether there will be one at all. The British monarchy has survived swords, scandals, and centuries, but can it survive us? Only time will tell.